Okay, so I'll start with this. So I am a researcher and a writer, also occasional performer, and I carry out for a number of years this inquiry. I call it an inquiry with the title Elusive Earths. In Spanish, it's Tierras Esquivas. And so as a researcher and writer, I've worked with different materials such as mud, milk, cheese, and what also I call terra sigillata, which is stamped clay. And what I'm looking for in these materials is the way that they become sort of something else in the passage of an exhibition or an essay. So they can be like what I call epistemological fodders. That means they're like kind of vessels. They have significance. So that's their theoretical grounding. And so they can kind of exist and contain other meanings or functions. Right, so like mud can be the use of mud, can be, it's like a passageway for some other kind of meaning that is later granted something. Some of these materials sometimes are like, I conceive them as absorbents or sort of traces. So in their trace, they contain this other meaning. So what I'm my quest, I think, is looking for what this other meaning can possibly be, or granting it some kind of significance when it's transitioning between materiality and entity. So when it is like its conceptual form and its material form. So what is that passageway, right? And what does that mean? And so that's where it grants sort of, I think, the corpus of the intellectual thinking behind the work. So yeah, for me, I started with mud, and it's also a way for me to thinking about what is sinking, hindered, when I was doing some writing in the past about time. And, I had curated this exhibition in Poland called A Clock That Runs on Mud. And I was thinking about, how mud can be a form of collectivity. I led this collective mud bath in the border of Lithuania and Belarus, in like a health spa, and I took a bunch of artists there, and we all began to sort of like collectively speculate on questions of time, but through mud. So I think it must have been then, when those kind of physiological speculations were coming through, that I was invited shortly thereafter to make an exhibition for a space in Brussels called Établissement en Face, which is a very important Brussels-based space, which has a lot of conceptual leanings, and voila, that's how Elusive Earths sort of initiated in a practical sense. And as I was working on mud, my partner, and who I lead this inquiry with, is Lorenzo Cirincione. He is a philosopher of science, a historian of science, and also an artist. And he was explaining to me that he had found these sort of interesting clay stamped pills, or they were called troches. Let me see if I have. This is the image of from the show in the invitation in Brussels. But these troches were stamped clay pills that were used for medicinal purposes, and they were originated in Lemnos Island, which is in Greece. And so we had done a number of sort of whole investigation into these pills to find out more about them. They existed in antiquity. There was a process around their coming into being. There was, for example, a priestess who would go and excavate this clay on the island of Lemnos, later shape these different troches, these pills, and then stamp them with a particular signia or sign, and then they were loaded on a cart and sent off to the outside world to be later kind of exported as a pharmaceutical kind of specimen. They later gained a lot of fame because they were used as like a monetary coinage. But before I get into the depth of the Limnian clay, I want to kind of talk about the whole umbrella of what Illusiverse is. So Illusiverse is for us like a research methodology. It considers testing different historical temporalities and that embraces multiple visual forms within these clays. And so, like over time, this has involved, say, different forms of replication of these processes, extraction, and multiplication, and their what I call them the distribution of the clays as a kind of narrative. So we're looking at these clays in history and also their present time changing entity. And so the Illusiverse, when I call it an inquiry, what's interesting, I think, for me about this is because it can materialize, say, as an exhibition. It also can be a paper. It is a talk, and we constantly involve a changing number of actors and participant or sort of contributors to the work. So there are a number of philosophers who've worked with us, or geologists, scientists, etc. But they're not coming across in a physical way in the work, but their work kind of seeps through the passage of the work itself. So here, I'm just going to scroll through. This is the first iteration, what I mentioned before, which considers the show in Brussels, and this was kind of more specific because it was like a group exhibition, however a little bit different, and I'll explain that why. So here in the forefront we have an image by Jean-Marie Apréau, a French artist, and you see this is a vessel which contains these edible clays. These were clays that I had sourced in the island of Milos, and also in Athens, and these are used to absorb toxins in the body. So we had brought back these clays. He had made this vessel, created this monstrous kind of entity that so as a viewer in the show, you could come and ingest the clay and then walk around, and people were kind of in the opening like eating and getting all like having like philosophical speculations about their toxins in their bodies, and it was a little bit like doing drugs, right? Here, I also use the metaphors through that group show in a number of ways, looking at questions of, say, self-multiplication, the traveling or transformation of bodies and generations, such as this case of here, the work by Ana Maria Maulino. So there are commissions in the work. There's also work that was historic work, such as this piece, which is from 1975. Also, I was looking a lot at the idea of the breeding of selves and bodies. This is Georgia Sagri performing also in the exhibition. This is a transforming piece of bread stamped work that had injected metal. This would change over the period of, it would kind of decompose over the course of the show. This is by A.J. Corian from New York. And then, yes, there's a number of works. This is by Annika Yi, who's getting a lot of, of attention right now. And this was so the show was very much of a very visceral live show where you could smell and sense these toxifying sort of substances burning in the exhibition. I'll just scroll through this. We can get to something a little bit more where it embraces like how we talk through the group exhibition, and then it shifts to the concerns of more like and this takes place in Bogota. But what I like to think about this when I'm talking about Illusiverse, I like to think of it as an inquiry, as a form. So the inquiry as form, what we do in the shaping of this process is we apply experimental protocols like first-hand interviewing, the analysis of historical text, and also pulling out of obscurity the social and daily use of rare earths that are elusive in their anthropological and archaeological record. So when I talk about the elusive, it's something you can't hold on to. They have a forgotten origin. We don't know sometimes why they existed and when they stopped being used or produced. And the idea is to bring that back into a circulation in some kind of form and understand its historical imprint. So, I think the key questions that we try to address in the inquiry is both as curators and artists are how can the inquiry be visualized and how can elusive earths consider process as an exhibition model. This is the poster that was later for the show that was done in Oaxaca in 2016, which we worked with I'll explain that piece in a little bit. Also, there's this huge question of how can performativity be implicated in the history of resource extraction and ceremony and celebration. How can this idea of ceremony and celebration resurface in the inquiry's materialization? So that's like, it's sort of like bringing back, it's a kind of a meta process that brings it back into the real world today as we understand it, and those political associations that can be near to the narratives, near to the clay narratives as they are developing. So here, this image that was just before was from Bogota. That was the second inquiry, and here is we're kind of looking at how to contrast anthropology's version of, this is terra preta, which is a very rich soil that is known for it being its potential to trap carbon, and elusive earth doesn't always just consider medicinal clays. It looks at other clays that have other functions, right? And this was a particularly different episode because it looks to sort of understand anthropology's sort of battling conversation with this substance, right? This biochar, because it's a conversion of agricultural waste into a soil enhancer that can hold carbon. So, I know that biochar is a very confusing soil right now in those circles because of where it was found, and it also its isolation for certain communities in the Brazilian Amazonian basin. So Brazilian and Colombian, actually. This is just another piece that we made from, these are like edible zeolite spaghettis. And here, this is the Oaxaca show where we brought across the a kind of itinerary of local earth consumption, which was traced from the 17th century Guatemala to a single family in Tlacolula who possessed the only remaining knowledge of how to reproduce that earth bread clay, that earth bread that was used to trap toxins, or sometimes it was used for pregnant women who had like a kind of antojo, like they had a little bit of a yearning to eat clay, and to understand why that was happening. It's not specific to Oaxaca, but it is known across the world that the eating of clays can be associated with pregnancy or with a lack of minerals in the body. So here we were looking at, like, the process itself was, if you can see in the back of this image, there is a small, at the very corner, I don't think you can see it because of this PDF, but the idea was in the exhibition space that we had this sort of very unintelligible piece that almost blended in the wall. So it created almost a tension between the piece that was in front of it, which was burning throughout the show. It was, and here in the front, so there are two different narratives, right? The one in the back is Tlacolula, which we were able to get one of these remaining earth breads, and she showed us how to produce it. The second here in the forefront is what is called chogosta, and it's commonly sculpted and barbecued clay used in Veracruz. And they're kind of like albóndigas. They're like meatballs that are used with herbs and barbecued on the pit, and then you consume them. And it's quite, so we had set the gallery a little bit like into this barbecue kind of environment. And that was before the night had, before the sun had set. And then immediately when the sun had set, we turned off the fire, took the grill to the back of, to the side back wall, and it became, the structure itself becomes a kind of painting, or this is the chogosta balls. And it was a really interesting experience because it's very sensorial, right? The herbs and the clay. So this is how we this is a good example of understanding how we kind of replicate the processes that were. This is a replication. However, these are original. The chogostas. We don't create it from scratch. We always have some. Then lastly, these are just scroll through some of these images. This is also, sometimes we work with photographic archives. This is the great-grandmother of the woman I mentioned, and this is was kept in her archive in, we found this image from the Museum of Man in San Diego. We later made, so we kind of used that in another exhibition which talks about the photographic register. And here I just want to show you a little bit of images. I'm just going to scroll through how we work through with archival work. This is, for example, from researching all of the Lemnian clay in Lemnos, understanding the iconographic changes and shifts across the years, and also how they are like monetary systems. You can see how they're very beautiful. So I just want to give a few last comments, because I think, we're almost getting close to 4, about how Elusive Earth, how I consider it like this inventory. So it is an inventory of these clays and their imaginaries. So understanding, on the one hand, their market in history, how that has changed and how it was how it shifts in and over time, and how that changes in certain contexts. For example, these were hugely distributed and collected throughout Europe. And it's just interesting to think about something, the eating of coinage, right? Just wanted to show you, scroll through these. You can see the variety. It's incredible of all of the different, how they were stamped, and the variety of the clays and their purpose, just like coins. So just to give you one last image, I have a couple of images. So I think that what I could wrap up when we're thinking about the role of, say, or the logic of materials, is about how materiality and is how it can be embedded in different kind of cultural catalyzing forces. So I look at the role of these cultural catalyzing forces and what's going on in our real world, and the confrontation, say, with different problems in the Anthropocene, which is a term that is used often to understand a very molding and shifting world. So I kind of contrast those narratives in the past and the materials register with these concerns. And this is, lastly, just to show you something we're working on now. This is this is different earth breads related to the cult of the Cristo Negro, which is in Esquipulas, Guatemala, and there is still a somewhat large production, only one of the remaining productions of earth breads for consumption in that region, because we don't really see them here and produced no longer in Mexico. this practice has completely ceased. So that's why in the Mexico show you could only see that one bread. So sometimes the signatures are also shifting. The quality of the signature, the quality of iconography shifts. And for this example, in this case, you see here, these are some of the molds. So through time, also the molds and their iconographic or what they're depicting has also changed according to the maker, because it depends if that knowledge is transferred down through family or if it's transferred through, say, marriage, and it really changes across time what is stamped and the quality of the production. So this is why you see these are not as well produced, but look at the mass still quantity that is being produced and to be sold and for consumption in Guatemala. You can see it in the market. And right now we're working a little bit about this specific production and how, together with a number of images from the archives that are located in Sirma, in Antigua, which holds a great, wonderful collection of work done and investigation done on these clays throughout time, say from Esquipulas to Oaxaca to Chalma, and then up all the way to Chimayo in New Mexico. So it's really interesting to see how this consumption is also attached to a kind of spreading of a certain kind of myth. And this is, I think, what is the greater concern in the work. Also, we could talk about other concerns like what is artistic research versus, say, the production of fine art. And this is what I think also happens in this particular research project, is exposing those two tensions. That's also something probably pretty interesting related to materiality, and there is a debate going on about that. Like, how can you define an unprecedented artistic research that leads to a certain kind of knowledge production, right? But I think, and I can just wrap up with this. What I think is that I suppose what I'm interested in is how theoretical evidence and a kind of academic prowess or framework can allow the research methodology to be useful for art and also the exhibition. And it doesn't have to sacrifice necessarily the transgressive nature of art, because it doesn't have to have this binary between what is an artistic research practice versus like the whole work of art, right? And so that's what I think with this case example, what we're trying to constitute and to express. I don't know if we can talk about those larger questions in a Q&A if you wanted to, Kiki. Yeah.
I think we have time because there's nobody there yet. But no, I have lots of questions, actually. I don't think I have time to ask everything, but I find it really interesting, that model that you created. I mean, I can't think of that many other examples of how a kind of academic research intersects with and has a different manifestation as an exhibition. And I think it has to do with the nature of your research, because it is a research based on materials, no? And but what I find really interesting is that when you translate that into an exhibition, it's not like let's say one of those architectural presentations where you have images and text and like, or more kind of scientific. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
No, I think that's exactly a problem that we're trying to expose, is to really give another kind of avenue to the idea of representation. I think there's a lot in the art and science, this arts and science worlds, that there is a transliteration of scientific processes are translated into some kind of representation that is it it's a little too didactic sometimes, or a little bit too how can I say? Yeah, I don't know if it can hold always meaning for abstraction, and for us it's very important to still be able to address those ideas of abstraction, or like in the abstraction of relationships, of sorry. Ya acabó. No, bueno, lo hacemos. So yeah, I just think, just to wrap up that question, I just think that is the main concern, is to still grab hold of abstraction and what is visceral abstraction, right? And so how can that be expressed through processes and relationships between people and things? No.
Thank you very much.